see at this point, and we'll make do. So, thank you everyone for joining the first ever Dendron office hours. Let me pull up the Dendron page that we all know and love. So, the format of office hours, I'm going to be answering questions that you guys type in the chat, and I'm also going to answer the questions that people have posted in the Dendron office hours. And I will probably alternate between the two. So I'll do a couple in the chat and then a couple from the Discord group. So I'm going to start off with Discord group just because we have a bunch lined up. And if you guys have any questions while I'm doing that, just drop them in the chat. So first question, I'm going to zoom in, is how do you share your notes with other people? So it depends on how if the notes are already published. One of my favorite features in most often used commands in Dendron is the copy link command. So what I'm going to do is turn on screencast mode, and yeah, so you should be able to see the keys that I'm using. And so in Dendron, you can use Command Shift U if you're on a Mac to copy the link of the current note if it's published. If you highlight a header, then you can copy the link with the header at the very end. And this is super useful, and I use it all the time, especially when answering questions in Discord. If you ever wonder, like if Kevin is really a bot because he keeps spewing out links, I'm not a bot yet. It's because whenever anything happens, say somebody asks me about pods, I will go to pods and then I will copy a link and then I will drop that link into the Discord. And it's nice because it can usually go to the very specific section that people are asking questions about. So that's how I share my notes if they are published on Dendron, or if they're already published. The vast majority of my notes are not published, and depending on what the setting is, I will generally just copy and paste and then just email a note. This is going to be made easier in the future when we integrate email support right into Dendron. This is going to be done with pods. So for people who aren't familiar, let me just bring up the chat so I make sure that I don't miss out on whatever people are talking about. Oh yeah, screencast mode is awesome. I use it all the time for tutorials and whatnot, and it's just one of the million little things that VS Code will do for you ahead of time. Oh, and thanks for the next question. I will get to that in just a moment. So to finish off what we were saying, pods, how to share notes. If the note isn't already published, I usually just email it or use Google Docs or whatever it is that people use to get the docs. I often also use PennDoc to convert the docs into PDF. This is especially for sending stuff to manager types. But in the future, you will be able to use pods to send messages directly. So imagine, John, welcome to the Dendron office hours. Good to see you. And yes, pods are great. In the future, you'll have, for example, a Gmail pod or a Twitter pod, and you'll be able to send a note directly from within Dendron. And the really powerful thing about that is normally I stay away from anything that talks to my email just because I run my whole life out of Gmail. That's just the world that we live in. And so I'm very hesitant. I basically don't give any other application credentials to my emails. But what's cool with Dendron's local first approach is that you can manage all your credentials locally, which means that you can integrate with these more sensitive services like email, for example. and take advantage of that functionality while knowing that all your credentials are still stored locally. Um, so that was an aside on the how do I share my notes questions. But generally, it's if the node is published, I will use the copy link feature in Dendron. If the node isn't published, I will copy and paste it into whatever medium people expect it, often using Pandoc. And in the future, the way that I see most people sharing notes going forward, or a very common way of sharing notes, is using pods to share it directly into whatever platform you want to share it on. All right, now Space Omega. Question when I'm ready. You're curious about the long-term server web UI usage. It's probably useful for things like configuring schemas, but I want to hear the bigger dream. For example, using the server to render the notes, or even full-on embedding VS Code into some pages, though for what purpose is unclear. Are there any ambitious uses of it that you're excited for? Thank you for the question. And yes, there are so many things I'm excited for when it comes to the server. For people who aren't familiar, Dendron recently, by recently I mean in September, went through a whole architectural rewrite where we migrated from the normal client model to a client server model. So even though Dendron is local on your computer, the way that Dendron works is that the Dendron extension will talk to the Dendron local server. And this now decouples Dendron from VS Code. And so what we're doing now is Dendron basically can run anything that a modern web app can right inside VS Code. And so the most immediate thing we're doing with this is Tyler is building a front end for doing configs. And so if you're tired of working with YAML files or JSON files, worry not, because we will have a beautiful UI ready very soon. And so this is the preview of the config UI, which I'm super excited about. But longer term, as far as the web UI goes, I'm actually thinking that most of the things that we do inside VS Code can eventually be replaced by the web UI. So one example right now, the Dendron preview, is separate from Dendron publishing. So Dendron publishing, we use Jekyll, and Dendron preview, we use a third-party Markdown preview. But now that we have our server, we can actually render the Dendron preview via our server so that anything that you see in the preview is actually also the thing that you will publish. And so that's one exciting thing, which is just like merging, having one way of rendering the Dendron markup that will look and be the same both when you're looking at it locally and when you're looking at it on the website. And at that point, when you're already looking at the same thing, then the next step, one direction we could go is being able to modify the notes that you publish. So for example, like Dendron right now, it's a read-only site, but we've had a lot of people ask about web editors and being able to use this online. So you could imagine having like edit toggles inside the page and being able to do not just look up via the search, but also being able to edit your notes. As far as the web interface goes, like long term, I think we can actually end up migrating most, if not all, functionality from VS Code into or web engine interface. And what that means is that we can eventually have both a standalone editor or a web editor that is completely decoupled from VS Code. And what's cool about that is right now we're running into a bunch of limitations. In VS Code, for example, if you try to do a lookup, there's no way of auto-completing. That's just not supported by the VS Code input component. But imagine in the future, if instead of using the lookup auto-complete component, you can use a full-on search bar. trying to find a preview for this. But React Autosuggest is actually one of the things that I used originally when I was building Dendron from scratch as a web client. Um, and so what we could do, for example, is we could embed the this autosuggest UI into VS Code as a web view, and then add more functionality into it that today, for example, isn't possible within VS Code. Um, Yeah, but ultimately, the idea with having the web server available is that it now couples us or decouples us from VS Code. Anything that is possible to do in a modern web application, we can now do with Dendron. And that is super exciting. All right, what is the next question? All right, this one's from Tom. Questions to get the use of Dendron site template from the question channel. I hit the template button on Dendron site as this holds the notes and I used to generate dendron.so, and I'm kicking around a few changes or additions. Templates are a new GitHub thing to me, and I'm still working on wrapping my mind around them. Me too. Reading the GitHub documentation on them, they seem to be of two minds. On one hand, they seem to be a lightweight forking mechanism, or let's see, to be continued, or when you are into using the solution the repo provider provides for your own work. I use this for my description for the template, pushing the button, place on the GitHub account, can be empty. And so am I right about this? Could I empty out the vault, git clone it locally, and open and re-put my notes and mark it down for independent? Okay, so Tom, thank you for the question. And essentially what I'm getting is, can I use the Dendron site repo, get rid of all the notes, and then just use it as your Dendron vault? So if we go to the Dendron site, this is the repository that we use to publish the Dendron notes from. So you could totally clone this, get rid of all the Dendron notes, and then just do your own thing, but it's not necessary. So the easiest way, and the way that we recommend people start off, is if you have Dendron installed already, then you can just use the Dendron initialize workspace. And when you do this, you can select a workspace. You can say, and you can select if you want to initialize it with or notes, or just initialize an empty one. And I have this prompt because I already have a workspace there, but I'm going to go ahead and delete it and initialize it with the new workspace. And when I initialize this new workspace, you see a bunch of old stuff on it because VS Code loads up the files of your previous session. But this is my new workspace now. And the only an empty workspace has two files, which is your root markdown file and then your root schema file. We also give you a couple of useful VS Code snippets to start off from. But if you want to start with an empty workspace, this would be the recommended way to do it. If you do want to use a template workspace, Dendron site, we used to have this as a template, but it was problematic just because we have so many notes on Dendron site. So if you wanted to use something a little bit more slimmed down, we actually have a Dendron template repository. And the Dendron template repository is basically a slimmed down version of the Dendron site. It's also what you get when you do initialize workspace with the Dendron tutorial notes. So that's the first option up here, initialize with Dendron tutorial notes. And what it is essentially is it's the same thing, except you have this quick start and you have a general installation instruction. Okay, I think we covered the current questions on the Twitch, so I'm going to switch back to the Discord. So we have one question about workflow for developing new features on Dendron. I can get into that, but it's a longer-ish answer. So I'm going to save that for the end to see if we still have time. And I'm going to answer these shorter questions first. So the next question is YAML and JSON schema definitions. Will there be YAML or JSON schema definitions to improve the editing experience? The answer is yes, we will improve the editing experience. And there's multiple ways we're going to do this. First of all, we will be working on having a front end for it. So similarly, basically to Tyler right now is working on a front end for editing the Dendron configuration. We'll actually have a graphical front end for working on schemas. And that should be much more intuitive for people to use, and you can drag and drop and move things around. If you are not into the UI and you're like, I'm all about that command line, we've already started adding some auto save features in the schema. So for example, right now, I just created a project schema. And if I, for example, add something invalid into here, like, oh, it's a dash with nothing in it, then what's going to happen is Dendron will actually say, hey, this is invalid. So regardless of if you are editing schemas with the YAML, or if you'll use a graphical interface, which we will ship probably before this year is over, the plan is to tell you at the point that you're making the schema if there's anything wrong with the syntax. Are we specifically going to make like a JSON schema spec? I don't know. We could if that's useful, but I think that if we provide the auto validation, that should cover most sources of errors. Let's see. The next question is, will there be an API to extend Dendron functionality? And the answer is yes. And I'm super excited about this API because right now, Dendron is running as a REST server, which means that if you want to build plugins on top of Dendron, they don't have to be JavaScript. They don't have to be TypeScript. As long as whatever you're writing on can talk in REST, so talk over HTTP, which is basically any language ever, then you can interface with Dendron. It's also going to be possible in terms of decoupling from VS Code to launch Dendron without VS Code. So today, if you go, let's see, to the project CLIs, we actually have a command called launch engine server. And this is actually what happens behind the scenes when you use Dendron. And so this is going to start the Dendron HTTP Express server in the background. So in the future, you can imagine accessing most, if not all, of Dendron's functionality without even having VS Code open. And what's cool is, for example, like I use Alfred, which you can't see right now because it's on my other screen. But it's basically a launch bar. And so you can query Dendron using other services. Anything that can talk HTTP can talk to Dendron. Now, we haven't really publicized this API yet because we're still working on stabilizing that API. And if there's one thing I learned from working at AWS is once you put an API out there, you have to support it forever. And so that's something I really want to make sure we get right, is having an API that is consistent and that won't break. And so it's probably going to be closer to the end of the year until we formally document the Dendron API. But for now, if you do want to develop stuff, the low-hanging fruit right now is working on pods. We'll be making it possible to write your own custom pods to publish and export or import stuff into Dendron or out of Dendron. These will be both using TypeScript or JavaScript or using the API, and more details to come. Okay, now I'm going to drink some tea and then go back to the Twitch. Okay, Space Omega, have you considered Dendron-related services that might be offered for monetization. For example, syncing, having an encrypted Git repo, and having an encrypted Git repo service as an example. The answer is absolutely. So part of my plan with Dendron is long-term sustainability. And so you can read about this on the Dendron website. I'm going to be posting the link into this chat. But the general idea for Dendron is that I want to work on Dendron full-time for the foreseeable future, and I also want other people to do the same thing. And to do that, I want to make sure that it's sustainable and that people don't have to sacrifice to do so. And so we're definitely looking into adding value add services. And so we have a list of ideas and projects that are in that category. Now, that being said, Dendron is open source and the client will always be free. And that's not something that's going to change. The places where we will charge money is where we add server-side additions. So for example, it is like the encrypted Git syncing service that we might potentially offer. The way that I think about it is that anything that you can run yourself is free and open source. And anything that we would host or manage on your behalf, now that is something that we would charge for. The low-hanging fruits as far as services to offer, one is definitely syncing. So being able to have your notes, sync it privately, and have it available anywhere else you use it, that's one value add service. And then the other one would be publishing. Today, for publishing, you can publish using GitHub Pages for free, but I've had a lot of people ask about private publishing. So what if I want to make my notes available, but not to everyone? And what if I only want to share it with a few people and add some additional functionality? So in that case, we're looking at actually helping people host private engine sites. And so that would be another value add service. If this sounds very much like the Obsidian value added services, it kind of is. And it's because we offer kind of similar value propositions in the terms of having a free client and then offering value added service on top of that. And I think the most common things that people need in this case are both synchronization and then in publication. Except with the added, Dendron has the added benefit that publication is already available for public sites. Let's see. Oh, so Tom mentions that notes started in VS Code. So this is using the initialized workspace, wouldn't be under Git control. So I'm assuming what you're saying is that it wasn't, if you use initialized workspace, so what we just did to initialize this, there's not a Git repository with it, which is right. You will need to run git init, and then you would need to create a GitHub repo and then push this to the GitHub repo to set that up. And so that is a value that you get if you decide to clone from the template. And that is also why we have it available. Oh, and I noticed that Dendron template right now isn't actually available as a GitHub template. So let me just make it available. So great. So yes, if you want to have a Dendron Vault with GitHub integration from the get-go, one thing you can do is you can go to dendron.template repo and use this template button to get started. I'm going to post this in the chat, and then I will also add it to your documentation. And what might happen in the future actually is when you run initialize workspace, we will give you an option of just cloning from that template. So you can do it all in one step. All right, let's see, next question. Armored Houseplant, welcome to the chat. Can you talk more about the future of schemas? What's coming down the pipe? Especially interested in hearing about the graphical interface. Okay, So schemas. Schemas, I get lots of questions about schemas. And so first, for people that are not familiar, you can think of schemas kind of for Dendron, kind of like schemas for databases. They help make sure that what you have inside Dendron is consistent with what you think you have. So database schemas, they help make sure that your data is not corrupt, that it's all structured in the same way that you expected. And that's what Dendron schemas do, is they make sure that if you write a schema for a hierarchy, that all hierarchies are consistent with that schema. Today, schemas do a limited number of things. Um, I will go to my own vault and demonstrate some of that. So right now, you can tell if a node has a schema because there is a little book icon next to it. Um, so these book icons mean that the the node that you see has a schema. And it's good for autocomplete, for example, because you can tell, hey, if I'm studying a new language, like what are the valid um, options that fit inside that hierarchy. Um, I'm gonna drink some more tea. All right, Tyler, I see that you got a gun. Thanks for joining, and talk to you later. So what is coming down the pipeline for schemas? Today, schemas don't actually do enforcement. Schemas will tell you if something doesn't match the schema by not showing you a book icon. So for example, if I create a node called L Python nonsense, for example, Dendron will let me create it. It's just that now when I actually look at the node, there is no book icon, which tells me that it's not in the schema. In the future, you can define schema settings to be strict. And in that case, Dendron will actually prevent you from making files that go outside of the schema. This is useful, especially if you are working in teams and you're sharing a vault between teams, because it's a way of making sure that you have a consistent way of organizing your information. And so for one example is if you have multiple teams doing multiple projects and you want to make sure that all projects are structured in the same way, maybe all projects should have milestones or goals and retrospectives, then you can enforce that at the schema level. And you can, and so that does a couple of things. One, it makes sure that people can't go outside of that. And two, you can generate reports on that. So for example, you can look into, hey, out of all the projects that I'm doing, how many of them actually have the full schema? That is milestones, goals, and retrospectives. And you can think about this almost like a coverage report, but for your information. So out of all the information I have, like how much of it is actually complete and how much is missing. So that's most immediately, that's going to be one of the areas of focus is using schemas to both enforce hierarchy and also gather metrics on the hierarchies that you do have. Um, and then there's a bunch of other options like being able to use schemas to, for example, specify more of the font matter and also make it easier to create notes. But that stuff is a little further away. If you guys have any ideas or things that you want to see in schemas, then yeah, by all means, please drop it in the chat in our Discord or give us an issue. Oh, and Armin Houseland, you talked about the graphical interface, which I haven't talked about much. Essentially, the first version of the graphical interface, you can think of it as a mind map kind of view, where you can drag and drop different nodes around. And so that would be offered alongside or typical way of authoring schemas, which right now is YAML. I like YAML. I realize most people or a lot of people don't. And so the graphical interface is basically letting you do what you currently would do in YAML, but using a GUI instead. And then I'm going to do one more question here before I jump back to Discord. Kiran, it's good to have you in the chat, and I will see you later. Um, how would you publish to, so Tom asks, how would you publish to a guest? So you can see what a set of notes from a browser. So if you wanted to publish to a gist, then there's multiple ways to do it. I think VS Code actually has a gist extension. So if you look, yeah, I think it's called GistPad or Gist something. Yeah, GistPad. I am gonna add this link to the chat. So this is one way you can publish your notes, is just using this extension to do it. And I believe it works with Markdown files that you already have. If you want a more native way of doing this, my answer for that is generally going to be pods. So we will be adding more pod integrations, especially with GitHub. Right now, we're looking at adding a GitHub issues pod so that you can take a note and post it as an issue. But we'll also be looking to adding, for example, a gist pod and other sorts of pods. I hope that answers your question, but feel free to add more context if it doesn't. Now I'm going to jump back to the chat after drinking some tea. Sponsored by Allergo tea. Mm-mm-mm. That was my AirPod. Okay. Next question. What is your plan for long-term sustainability of Dendron? How can we make sure that Dendron is still around for months and years? Thanks for asking the question. And that's something that I also want to see, which is having Dendron for the foreseeable future. So we talked a little bit about this earlier when Tyler asked about value-added services, for example, like having encrypted sync. And in general, that is the direction I see Dendron taking in terms of long-term sustainability. We do currently have we do currently have an environmentalist plan, and you can actually access it if you do Dendron contribute. So that is going to take you to a site where you can subscribe to be an environmentalist and get access to perks and also early access to unreleased features. And we have a bunch of environmentalists, and you guys are great. And thank you so much for supporting me. I think for the vast majority of people, the value add is going to be in the value added services. For example, having hosted sync or managed publishing and other such features. These features, what they all share in common is that they have a server-side component. And even though it is something that you could probably manage on your own, for most people, it's going to be more of a hassle to do that. And so Dendron will offer a subscription for doing that on your behalf. We're also looking into a Teams version of Dendron. At its most basic, I mean, Dendron, you can already think of it as a Teams product because every vault is essentially a Git repo, and you can share your Git repo with other people. But there's definitely a lot more we can do to make that process smoothly. Where I kind of see Dendron going in that direction is, for example, a confluence that doesn't suck. So being able, especially if you're a dev, having a knowledge base that you can easily access locally, easily edit, and then easily share with others, and building some value-added features around that. All right. Next question. So another schema question. Are there any plans to simplify the need to create schema files, which feel a bit complicated? I feel like this capability should be automated or simplified. Yes, I agree completely. Um, First thing about schemas is that they're optional. Using Dendron does not require that you use schemas. Schemas are helpful, but not required. So I compare it to like an optional type system. For example, like in TypeScript, or now that they're adding it in Python. Now, that being said, I think you'll get a lot of benefit from using schemas, and we want to make it simpler. So stuff that's coming down the pipeline, for example, is a graphical interface. In the future, we do want to look at making it for giving schema suggestions. So, for example, just like with most tools, you have templates for here's a template for project management, and here's a template for home improvement. Um, that's one way you can imagine schemas being made simpler is we can have a schema repository for most of the common things that people do. Um, and this helps you start from an already pre-vetted set of schemas instead of creating stuff from scratch on your own every time. Sparwarati, I hope I'm pronouncing your username correctly, +1 for the Teams version. I think Dendron might be used to replace GitHub Wiki and all the other tools. Yes, I'm not gonna lie, that is definitely one of our ambitions. Is I think GitHub Wiki and DevOps Wiki and Confluence, the tool. I think the tools were made with good intentions, but there's a lot that doesn't work well. And it doesn't, I think one thing that SharePoint, for example, has taught us is it doesn't matter how many features your tools have, if it's not built on a foundation where it's easy for people to access and it's easy for people to use. And so that's what I'm hoping, or I want to take Dendron to, is a team-based, that teams can use it as a team-based wiki without having to jump through the hoops that are associated with the more traditional knowledge bases that you find in Confluence and other such tools. Futogami, welcome to the channel. I think we are reaching, so we've reached the end of the Discord submitted questions. So the one thing that is left is my workflow for working on Dendron. Unless somebody has another question in the chat, I'm going to switch over to VS Code and go a little bit over my development process. After drinking some more Allegro tea. Allegro, if you're watching, Dendron is not taking sponsors, but it would be cool. I'm kidding. We are taking sponsors. If you want to sponsor us, please go right on ahead. Okay, we have 10 minutes left in this very first office hours of Dendron. And so I'm going to go over the last question, which is my workflow for working on Dendron. So I work inside VS Code. I'm not going to go over how I set up Dendron. That's documented in the Dendron dev setup instructions, and I refer you to go there. But my typical workflow is, let me close some tabs. I have a daily journal note that is all Dendron related. And so in that, I have tasks that I do. Okay, let me back up. I have a daily journal note. Every day in the morning, I create a new journal. So let's do one for tomorrow. The hierarchy of this daily journal note is Dendron, and then journal, and then today's date. I then have a snippet that I use that pre-fills this day with certain sections. So tasks are things that I like to do every single day. And it starts with filing the stuff I didn't get done from yesterday, going through issues on GitHub, going through discussions that I might have missed, updating the weekly release, responding to people in Discord, and that sort of stuff. Once I go through my daily checklist, I will look at whatever tasks are current right now. So I have a weekly journal for Dendron, and under the weekly journal, I have current initiatives. Oops, I also have lots of keyboard shortcuts apparently, and everything I do is a keyboard shortcut. So I have lots of things under current. And so right now, what I'm working on is replacing the Dendron Markdown Notes extension with, or in-house functionality. And then there's stuff for multi-vault, and then the teams, and then a bunch of other stuff. But, oops, that is another shortcut. So I'll look at current items, and usually under current items, for example, if we look at Markdown Notes, I have items for different days. And so these are my tasks for today. And I will usually make a note reference of the day and embed it into my daily journal for Dendron. And then I will work off that. For example, these were the things that I was working on today. I realize the text is a little fuzzy. So next time we do this, I'll make sure that we have a higher resolution. Yeah, I'll make sure we'll have better resolution. And anyways, once I figure out what tasks I'm going to work on, I work inside. What I do is, well, then I do the task. I split my VS Code into multiple panes. This is because Dendron, it's actually a collection of multiple projects. And so what I like to do is I have this one pane. Oh, let's see, there's so many things going on. Where do I start? Kind of toggle the screencast mode so you can see the shortcuts. I have a bunch of tabs open, and what I'll do is first I'll toggle it so I can expand the tab that I'm currently in. This tab is for plugin related code. This tab is for engine related code, and this tab is for testing related code. And this lets me just quickly jump between the three sections. Usually when I work on, for example, if I wanted to add a new command to Dendron, I typically start by writing some test cases. I'm one of those wackos that believes in test-driven development. So I'll write a test case, and then I will add the command, and then I will run the test case. And then if things work well, I will publish it. That's a super high-level overview. I think I'm actually going to be streaming my development of Dendron either this month or early in December, so you guys can get a better idea of what that process is like, and also because it'll be helpful for new contributors to hopefully see how I go about solving issues. So because of the resolution, I think I'm just going to punt that until I do the actual dev stream. Okay, let's see. We have a couple of minutes now before the first office hours comes to an end. So anyone on the chat have any more questions before we close? So this one's from Kiran. Do I move between daily and weekly organization? Yes, I do. Um, so typically, I have every day I have a daily journal, and I keep two separate daily journals. So one for Dendron, and I have another one for my personal notes. So my personal notes, it's under daily.journal, and then when I close this sample onboarding, and then my Dendron journal is under dendron.journal. Um, for my personal notes, what happens is I have things I'm thinking about, a mantra, things I'm grateful for, and then I have basically light schedule that I wrote up the night before for the day. Um, for my Dendron journal, it's much more tactical, things I need to do for the day. At the end of the week, what happens is I have a weekly journal. Um, let's see, what can I show without getting me or other people in trouble? Eh, okay, I'm not brave enough yet to show the weekly journal. But I have a weekly journal, and then what I do is I go through all my daily journals, and I pick out highlights. So, for example, I have sections in my weekly journal about what went good this week, what could have gone better, what did I learn, what dungeon related things did I accomplish, what personal related things did I accomplish. And then I will make wiki links between my weekly journal and the daily journal that has more details on that. And that's how I relate or aggregate my daily journals into my weekly journals by specifically picking out things that were meaningful to me in that week. And then I generally don't go beyond that. Like I don't do monthly journals because I find weeks are provide a pretty good cadence. And then every half a year or a year, I'll do a review of the weekly journals that have come before. Uh, So Kiran has an elaboration, longer time horizons. Well, I hope the like monthly or like yearly review answers that. I generally don't go for longer than a year because I find that it's really hard for me to put things in context beyond a year. Um, at some point, I might do a multi-year review where I look at the past 5 years, but right now, like there's enough going on that I find that a year is really like the max granularity that is useful for me at this point. Um, Tom has a question on templates. What is your use for templates and scripts? I don't actually make a lot of use of templates because I mostly rely on VS Code snippets because I find snippets are more powerful and more flexible. Um, I usually, when I make, yeah, um, so my answer for templates is I generally use VS Code snippets because it's easier for me to create and it's easier for me to change. Um, a little known fact is Dendron actually has a way of creating snippets because typically in VS Code, if you want to make a snippet, you have to do it in JSON. But in Dendron, if you select a bunch of text and then let me turn on screencast mode so you can see what I'm doing. If you select a bunch of text and do create global snippet and type in a name, for example, foo, um, Dendron will actually make that snippet for you. And so now, if I type in foo and new tab, that snippet is now here. It's a lot easier than navigating to a JSON file, writing JSON. Um, and so my predominant use for templating is in the form of VS Code snippets. Next question. How do you deal with old notes, like Sketchpad notes that need to be partially archived? Oh, Conrad. Hey, Conrad. Thanks for joining, and also thanks for catching all the bugs. Hopefully, your job will be less busy in the future. As far as archive notes, here's my thoughts on them, and different people have different ideas. If you look at, so I create a ton of sketch notes. For example, if you look at my Scratch notes for '09 of this year, these are all notes. I generally don't bother to archive them, and I actually just leave them be. If there is something important in a Scratch note that I need at a later point in time, then I will make a wiki link from that Scratch note into a new note. And so, for example, that note might be a project retrospective, or it might be like project planning, but some higher level aggregate note. In that aggregate note, I will reference the different Scratch notes that are pertinent to it. And that's how I deal with it. But otherwise, I just leave the Scratch notes alone. Um, I find them actually pretty useful, especially when I'm looking for things back in time. And oh, I see that's your question is, what about search pollution? For search pollution, so I don't actually use search a lot. Most of I do bullet journal format. So most of the things I need are in my daily journal note. So in my daily journal note, I usually have the links of everything I happen to be working on at a particular point in time. Um, Anything that I need to look up, longer case, I will actually organize. So for example, I have a Dendron hierarchy. Um, and under Dendron, oh, hold up. That's not the Dendron hierarchy. So because I have many thousands of nodes, it takes a moment sometimes for things to load, which I need to optimize, but because nobody else has this problem, it's been in the back of my to-do list. Um, Anyways, the way that I think about Scratch notes is that or the way that I think about searching, I generally never search. For example, if I need to reference something, then it's in a hierarchy already. And so the example that I usually go to is if I want to look up different programming language constructs. Um, let's see. I also am using a beta version of Dendron, so things might also look a little different. Um, let's see, Booleans. So usually I will directly go to notes that I need to reference. If I want to look up Booleans for Ruby, then I know how to access that, and that's one of the strengths of lookup. Is if you need to reference something and it's in a well-defined hierarchy, then you don't need to search. The times when I do need to search is generally trying to answer the question of what was that project I was working on the week before that had something to do with vaults? And in that case, I actually find Scratch notes are really useful without being refactored because I can use the search functionality in VS Code. And what you can't see right now is under files to include. For example, I can say, look for everything under Dendron Scratch that fell within the week of 2020 11 that had the word vault in it. And then that gives me precisely those results. And so for me, it's actually more useful for me that I don't refactor my Scratch notes because they have the timestamp of when they were created, and it's a hook that lets me better search for what I need. Um, so I guess to answer your question, um, for most things, I use lookup, and I will take the time to put stuff into the right hierarchy when it comes to things I need to reference. For the things that I tend to work on day to day, and that's usually what I use Scratch Notes for, I will keep it as is, and and I find it more useful because I can use the time component in the path to filter my search when I need to find it. Okay, we are actually now 5 minutes over office hours. So thanks everybody for tuning in. And we'll do this again in 2 weeks. So if you have any feedback about office hours, about me, or anything else, feel free to leave them in the Discord. Twitch is new to me, and this whole format is new to me, but I kind of like it, and I want to do more of it. So anything that I can do better next time. Just, yeah, drop me a line. Meanwhile, see everyone on Discord and other places, and have a great rest of the week. So, bye everyone.